Welcome back to Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Jeremy Lapidus. If you are just tuning in, we just finished going over the top 10 NBA mock draft that takes place tomorrow night. We will see the Hawks with the number one overall pick. If they keep it, if they trade out, I have them taking Alex Sarr at number one overall. In this segment, though, we are going to move out of the NBA for the day, talk a little bit about the NHL, the Stanley Cup. We finally have a champion crowned in the National Hockey League as the Florida Panthers stave off the reverse sweep that was almost thrust upon them by the Edmonton Oilers, winning 2-1 last night in a thrilling game, a crazy third period down the stretch, especially with some great defensive plays, great goaltending, and an interesting choice for Conn Smythe. So we'll talk about all of that in these next two segments. But before we get into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a message in it. That message should pop up on the bottom of the screen for you, me, and everybody else around the world to see. If you do have a burning question about sports, anything at all that you would like to ask, go ahead and throw that in the comments. I'll get to it as soon as I possibly can. I appreciate all of you guys for sticking around, talking some sports with me here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. But like I was saying, we are going to get into the world of hockey here with the Panthers winning their first ever Stanley Cup. The Panthers have played a lot of hockey. I just want to start off with that. They've made it to the Stanley Cup 2 years in a row. They finally get their first one after losing in 5 last year to the Vegas Golden Knights. This game 7 was the way that the Panthers know they could play. This is the way that we expected the Panthers to play this series the whole way through, right? Even in the games they were winning, even in the games 1, 2, and 3 that they were winning, they weren't playing like this the whole time. You talk about domination defensively. Outside of that third period, when the Oilers really started to get desperate, the defensive and even then the defense was incredible for the Florida Panthers. They were able to make stops on wide open nets. It was a great defensive game plan, and whatever they did in games 6 and 7 against Connor McDavid to shut him down, it worked to perfection. He had a total of 2 shots in those last 2 games, 0.0 goals, no offense coming from the best player in the world in the last 2 games after he scored 4 points 2 games in a row to put them in that situation for game 6 and game 7. The Panthers played great. We saw exactly why they made it to the finals, right? We saw exactly why they were up 3-0 in the finals. Sergei Bobrovsky had a great game. That defense, that elite defense, that best defense in the league showed up. They were able to shut down this best offense in the league. They scored opportune goals, these dirty opportune goals, and they were able to just not make mistakes. What was really killing them in the 3 games that they lost leading up to game 7 was the fact that they just kept making mistakes. They kept turning the puck over. They kept giving the Oilers breakaways. And even in the one breakaway that they gave away tonight or last night against the Oilers, they were able to cash it in, right? The Oilers were 5 for 5 on breakaways in their last couple games, right? They were able to figure out the power play for the Oilers. They were able to shut them down. They didn't let a single power play goal in. That defense, like I said, that energetic defense, they were able to play fast, play physical, and play within themselves. They always are fast, physical, and aggressive, but what I think really was getting to them in games 4, 5, and 6, and what really killed them is they were getting over aggressive. And that's not to say that they weren't over aggressive last night. Again, that's their play style. Their play style is, I'm going to get you. What are you going to do about it? But they were, playing within themselves instead of trying to, kill the other team, right? And that's what really did it. They got back in the locker room after the game. They said this was the least nervous they'd been all series long, which is a little hard to believe. All the pressure is on you. You're about to be possibly enshrined in history as just the second team ever to get reverse swept in the Stanley Cup Finals, first one in 80 years. All of Canada is rooting against you. You have no cup in Canada for 32 years now. That's continues to grow. There's a lot of there's a lot of storylines here, right? And they were able to put it all aside, play their game, which is something they had just gotten away from in recent games, and that's why they were struggling, right? Sergei Bobrovsky came back and played vintage Sergei Bobrovsky like we saw him. There's a question, he didn't end up winning that Conn Smythe trophy. It ended up going to Connor McDavid, and we'll talk all about that actually in our next segment because that's a really interesting story here. But Sergei Bobrovsky, outside of those 3 games where he gave up, 5, 6 goals each game, right? He played incredible this entire postseason, and I want to give him his flowers, and I'll give him more flowers. We'll talk about the comparison there between him and Connor McDavid in the Conn Smythe in the next segment. But he played vintage game. He played like he did in the first couple games of the series, where he was a brick wall, where no matter how good the Oilers were playing, he wasn't letting anything through. And a lot of that, it's not just on him, especially in that third period. There were 3 or 4 scrums around the net. There was one where he was on his back. There was one where he was completely on the other side of the net. And the defensemen and the sticks of the Florida Panthers were able to stop these wide open shots from going into the net. They were stopping the shots. They were taking it, blocking those shots with their bodies, just not letting anything get to the net. And that's the kind of swarming defense that they were playing. There's no really other way to describe it the way it was. There were 3 or 4 occasions in the last like 10 minutes of the game where the Oilers, and where there were like 9 of the 10 players on the ice were all inside of the crease, right? There was just a big scrum there, and Bobrovsky was strong enough to hold off the puck. The Panthers defense did a great job not letting anything get through. It was just a great team performance all around. Connor Verhaeghe, Mr. Clutch, scores a goal, has an assist. Sam Reinhart scores the game-winning goal on a tough angle shot off in the second period. And then that defense, like I said, that defense shines. That's what they've been known for. That's what they relied on, getting all the way to the cup and ending up lifting the cup there. It was just a great team game by the Panthers, and they absolutely deserved it. This is their first ever Stanley Cup win. They had only won 1 game in the Stanley Cup final ever before this series. That was last season against the Vegas Golden Knights. They've been a franchise for 30 years. Bringing a cup down to Florida means a couple things, right? The NHL continues to expand, and I think we're seeing that a lot, especially with it being back on ESPN and being that publicized. When it was on NBC, there just weren't enough eyes on the game. Getting a warm weather city to win a Stanley Cup, I think it's hard to underestimate how much that's going to mean, right? Hockey is king up in Canada, right? It's cold, you can play all the time. Hockey is king up in Minnesota. Up in the Northeast, there's a lot of great hockey cities, a lot of great hockey fans. It's been a tradition for a long time. It gets cold, you can play, right? But down in the South, it's warm. It's hard to get these ice rinks. Getting a cup down there, that's what they were trying to establish down in Arizona. It didn't end up working. They moved to Utah. Getting a cup down in Florida, especially after the success of the Tampa Bay Lightning just a couple seasons ago, is huge for the continued expansion of the NHL as it continues to grow. I think, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I bet you this was the most watched Stanley Cup final in history. The amount of publicity, excuse me, that it was getting was huge. Connor McDavid being on that tear, almost having a reverse sweep. It was so many great storylines in it, but the Panthers end up raising the cup. We saw potentially the final nail in the Sergei Bobrovsky Hall of Fame case go in last night as he lifted the cup. He was handed it second. For those who don't know, there's a tradition. The captain gets the cup first from the commissioner, and then they go and they hand it off. And it's kind of like a respect thing of who gets handed the cup. It's like an order. Sergei Bobrovsky got it second. That's the biggest amount of respect you can get, because captain always gets it first. So it's deserving. It's really cool to see that ceremony, and that's why I love the Stanley Cup playoffs, right? Not only is it the most intense playoffs, right? There's so much action nonstop, so physical, but, there's all these traditions. The Stanley Cup, Lord Stanley is the greatest trophy in all of sports. No one else has every single name etched on it that's ever won. No one else has the mystique and lore around it. You get to spend a whole day with it, do whatever you want. There's so many stories around that cup. It's got its own body. It's got 2 bodyguards, for God's sake, that just their job is to travel around with the cup. There's no other trophy in sports that is like that, and it's special to see. We love the ceremonies over there. Same, Alexander Barkov gets his, first cup. All these Florida Panthers that have been with the team forever finally get that moment. I don't think they'll be back. This felt like a last hurrah, and I know that's kind of weird to say coming off of a cup win, but this felt like a last hurrah for them. This is a team that's old. There's a lot of players retiring. This is a team that, I don't think they're just going to fall off a cliff, right? I think they'll still be playoff team next year. I think they'll still be a top 3 seed in their division, and I think they probably will win a playoff series. But playing this much hockey, finally getting it, they can kind of finally let that sigh of relief out, relax, and they got one, right? They finally got one. They finally got over the hump of the Lightning that had been bothering them for all these years. They finally got into the cup, and then they lose, and then they make it back just the next season, and they are able to finish what they started. So it's a great run by the Florida Panthers. It does feel like they're done. They might be back, but we'll see. But one more thing to talk about in the cup, and we will in the Stanley Cup. We'll talk all about it here in the next segment. Or actually, before we do, the one thing with the Oilers, though, actually, I totally forgot to mention this, is their line changes, and this is one of the things that I didn't quite understand when I was watching this game, especially in that third period. If you look when they pulled the goalie with about a minute left, which they pulled their goalie way too late. Stuart Skinner was on the ice for way too long, trying to get that Oilers team back even, get it to overtime. He was on that ice for way too long, but you saw it. They had their guys. They had McDavid. They had Draisaitl. They had Hyman. They had Bouchard. They had all these guys out for way too long. And when they finally had to go on that last all-out attack, they had nothing left. They couldn't get the puck into the zone. It was trapped in the corner for the last 10 seconds. They couldn't dig it out. And that's on the coaching staff, really. They mismanaged that entire third period. And I know it's a lot on their bodies, a lot on the wear and tear of the Edmonton Oilers, but you have to be a little smarter than that. You have to let some of your fourth line depth that have been providing all of this option, doesn't have to be the fourth line, but your depth that's been providing all of this offense for the last 2 games. The top line didn't get anything in the first 2 games, in the last 2 games of the series, right? McDavid, no offense. Draisaitl had an assist, but no offense, right? Whatever the Panthers were doing, they were zeroing in on McDavid and not letting him get anything in those last 2 games. But the depth was coming through. Fogle was coming through. Janmark scored the only goal. He was coming through. This was a team that had the depth. They just weren't relying on it. And I think that was the downfall more than anything. Also, with how great the Panthers played, I don't think it would have mattered. But that stings because you think that if they had, let their number one sit one extra shift instead of having them out there for 5 of the last 7 minutes, maybe they could have made a push, sent it to overtime. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about Connor McDavid here in the next segment. We'll talk all about how he won the Conn Smythe, if that was the right decision, how the voting works, which is super dumb, actually. But we'll talk all about that and more coming up next here on Sports by GSMC Podcast Network.